Main Street, Wyoming is made possible in part by grants from Kennecott Energy, proud to be a part of Wyoming's future in the uranium exploration, mining, and production industry, and by the Wyoming Council for the Humanities, enriching lives of Wyoming people through the study of Wyoming history, values, and ideas.
Did you ever, as a child, pick up an old book in the library and look at the swirling patterns of color on the inside of the cover? It looked like malachite or marble, those smooth veined slabs of stone that you might see around a fancy fireplace or desk set. You could lose yourself in the swirling patterns. As far as I knew, those colors in the book could have been sliced paper thin from the rock itself. Not so. This week on Main Street, Wyoming, we're going to meet a Casper artist who makes this beautiful paper.
Tom, if you were working for bookbinders and had to do an edition of 300 copies, talk about what that would entail.
I'd get really bored.
Pick up a book in the rare book section of the library and open it. Inside the cover, you're likely to find a swirling pattern of colors known as marbling. It's a technique that dates back 4 centuries. Each piece of paper is done by hand, and the variety of patterns is infinite. In those days, it was considered a craft. Now, it's an art.
My grandfather used to have a lot of old books, and I think where a lot of us have encountered marbling first is as the end papers in old books. And I used to look at those and, I mean, really look at them with a magnifying glass, trying to figure out just how it was done. I was thinking, you know, well, you couldn't really draw that. That's too complex. I just really had no clue how it was done, but I was fascinated with the patterns, just fascinated with it. And in, I think, 1986, I reconnected with an old friend of mine from college who happened to mention that his girlfriend was a marbler. And that's the first I'd heard of marbling being done and being done now, and, you know, a person who actually did it and knew about it. And I asked, well, does she give lessons? And she did, and I went down to Taos, New Mexico, which is where they're living, and took a weekend workshop from her, and I was hooked. I've marked the side that I'm going to treat, and what this is a solution of aluminum sulfate. I'm going to brush this on the paper, be sure that the whole thing is kind of consistently damp, but not really soaking wet. I'm wearing gloves because this is the same essential solution as pickling alum, which anyone who's used that knows is a desiccant, which means it dries things, and it would really do a number on my hands if I didn't have the gloves. After I've got the paper treated, I'm going to just slide it between some blotters to remove the excess moisture and also keep it damp, because if the paper is damp, it's going to be easy to handle when I'm trying to print with it. Okay, do one more sheet. 17th century is essentially when marbling arrived in Europe from what is now the country of Turkey, the Ottoman Empire. And that's the kind of marbling which is called watercolor marbling, or Ebru from the Turkish. And it became quite an art form in Germany, and from there spread to the rest of Europe, and was most connected with the book arts, as I said earlier, and was used extensively up until about the beginning of this century in bookbinding. And at that point, changes in the way books were bound and the numbers of books that were being produced made it supposedly impractical to use hand-marbled paper as part of bookbinding. One thing I recently learned that I didn't know is that throughout most of the 19th century, even, books were frequently sold without bindings. And you would buy a book and you would take it to a bookbinder and have it bound, you know, in the leather of your choice, you know, in like genuine cobra skin with marbled end papers, perhaps. So that practice sort of ended at the end of the 19th century, and that had a lot to do with the demise of marbling as a commercial proposition. The liquid in the tank is called size in marbling, and what it is a mixture of water that's been thickened with carrageenan, which is a seaweed derivative. And it makes it sort of the consistency of unset jello, thickens it enough so that the paints will float rather than sink. And I'm just going to start by dropping color onto the surface. Color has to be kind of mixed up each time because it tends to settle really fast, since it is pigment and water with very few additives, in contrast to commercial paints, which have various additives to make them brush more easily and stuff. Things that are positive for a painter, for instance, in a color, or negative for marblers. And with the eyedropper, I'm just going to drop a series, and this color is pretty pale when it first gets put down on the tank, but it will intensify as it gets squeezed up with other colors. I'm just using the dropper to put a whole series of drops of color on. And you'll notice everything is taking place right on the surface. You shouldn't have any paint sinking.
To what do you attribute the revival in marbling?
Well, I think a lot of the interest started with the sort of general revival of interest in crafts that happened starting during the 60s. More specifically, it seems like since the late 70s and through the 1980s, there's been a renewal of interest in small press printing, in letterpress printing, in fine printing, and I think marbling as one of the traditional book arts kind of went along with that. And it's only now that marbling's sort of breaking out of specifically that book arts context into some other areas. We have actual marbling set up as part of the art program in some of the Casper schools, so they have their own equipment. But I also have gone to schools where I have taken the equipment, set it up, and the kids have marbled for a day, 2 days, you know, for however. and it's great. It's for kids, it's one thing that, you know, they can get really satisfying results right away, but they can also, each time they marble, they can see, well, if I used that color instead of this color, I would have something different. In other words, it's not something that you do and is exciting and then is over. It's something that they can see, you know, they can go on with if they want. And just because of the nature of the process, it's really involving, and that's also a good thing for kids. And then, you know, kids approach it without a lot of inhibitions. I mean, they don't know what you can and can't do. They don't know this hundreds of years of marbling tradition that's hard to break out of sometimes. So they'll just do things, and I mean, they'll do things that are phenomenal, that I'll think, well, that couldn't possibly work, but whoa, it does. And, you know, I always steal some good ideas from kids. The cat wants to be marbled. From Australia, from Britain. What this kitty is probably interested in is the oxgall in the paint. Oxgall is a dispersant that I use in the paint, and it's a fluid that comes from the gallbladders of cattle. And it's used as a dispersant, and it also is part of the chemical reaction that will bind the color to the paper. And hopefully the kitty will not want to take a swim.
Do cat whiskers give you a particularly fine design?
I tell people that, you know, cat hairs on the marbled paper are a mark of authenticity. They'll know it's my marbled paper. The behavior of liquids and the surface tension phenomenon is such that what you get are regular things happening, but with a certain degree of unpredictability. In other words, they're figuring out through mathematical theory that randomness has a pattern to it. Randomness isn't really random in the sense of, like, you know, total unorganized chaos. Things have patterns to it. And to figure out the mathematical models for these things is a fairly sophisticated and has to do a lot with, you know, I think it's Boolean algebra or untraditional kinds of thinking in both math and physics. But they are actually, you know, defining some of these seemingly random things like occur in liquids on the surface of a marbling tank. And when they can define those mathematically, they can get that math to behave on your computer screen in a certain way that you have computer marbling. The chemistry, the physics, the math to marbling is a pretty amazing thing that I don't really understand a lot about, but it certainly suggests a lot of different approaches for computer software that marbles. These rakes are made in such a way that they fit in the tank, and against the rim of the tank, I'm holding it against this side of the tank. I'm going to bring it across, and the teeth are spaced so that then when I bring it back, if I shove it up so it rests against the other rim of the tank, this pass will bisect the first pass. Okay, so it's starting to change from the round circles, the drops of color, into a cone pattern. And this is a way of just kind of spreading out the color in preparation for whatever pattern I'm going to end up with. And you kind of figure out the order you rake and comb in, and you'll know what pattern you're going to come out with. This works exactly the same way, except up and down in the tank instead of back and forth. Now, all these patterns have names from when they used to use the paper for bookbinding in the 19th century. This one I'm just doing is called a cascade pattern. If I bring it back up like that, bisecting that first pass, it's now called a feather pattern. Okay, and then I'm going to repeat that across and back pass with the longer rake.
Tom, if you were working for bookbinders and had to do an edition of 300 copies, talk about what that would entail.
I'd get really bored, but some marblers do make a living at doing edition papers. And what you have to do is remember, of course, the colors you use, the order in which you have used the colors, and then the particular combs and rakes you've used and in what order you've used them. So it's possible to get a paper, it wouldn't be photocopy identical, but it would be the same paper throughout the edition of 500. And again, when this was used, you know, in the last century for bookbinding, that was, the thing is, the suppliers would have catalogs and you pick patterns and you would be assured that those patterns would be consistent throughout the run. Okay, this is a comb, which simply means it has a finer tooth spacing, and when the tooth spacing is that fine, you just want to bring it in one direction. You don't want to bring it up and back, because it would just sort of undo what you did if you tried to do it two directions. The pattern is looking a little less defined as I get it combed out finer, but when we get it on the paper, that definition will be more apparent. And one thing that I had to think about when I started marbling that I really hadn't paid too much attention to in school is color theory. The use of dark and light colors next to one another for contrast, just what certain colors look like next to one another. I have choices of what tools I'm going to use at any point, depending on what I want to come out with. This, I think, will just do a kind of a little curvy business down there that's going to transform that kind of straight, fine cascade into a more curvy type of deal. Okay. And that's probably about as much as I'm going to comb it. I could maybe take another step or two, but even though the colors will never physically mix with one another, if I get them combed out too fine, it might turn out so it would look to your eye like it was mixed. And it's the same as mixing every color in your paint box. If you do, you kind of come out with a muddy brown. America is probably where the most exciting things are happening, but there is a lot of marbling going on in Northern Europe and in Italy. Marbling originally came to America, we're sure, through Britain, and there's still a lot of marbling being done in England and in all the countries that were part of the British Empire, Australia, South Africa, and marbling in France, Germany. Originally marbling came from Turkey to Germany, and they're spread out all over Europe. There's also a Japanese kind of marbling called sumi nagashi, which is probably the origin of marbling, both European and Asian, and then the two forms sort of departed from one another at one point. But there is also a tradition of sumi nagashi, and there are sumi nagashi marblers, both in this country and of course in Japan and in other countries. So I can pick it right up. And that's the result. You'll notice that the color looks somewhat different on the paper than it did on the tank. Sometimes you can get real surprises. The last step in this process is going to be to rinse the paper. We just do that to get any size that's come off onto the paper, and if there's a little excess color, that will rinse off. But basically, the color will stay on the paper. It's been on there by a chemical reaction, so we don't get any color coming off appreciably. And then we're going to just hang it up to dry, and it's going to be ready to use for whatever. And usually in Wyoming, the humidity we have, that'll be dry in about 10 minutes.
This is Tom West's home and studio. He's serious about marbling, but as you can see, he's got a whimsical side too. It's not the sort of studio you'd expect to find in a town like Casper, or the sort of life.
The idea content is what really interests me about art. And the kind of innovation, both technically and intellectually, is interesting. And I think the standard, you know, like I say, moose and meadow, Standard Tetons may be interesting, may be pretty, may be decorative, but you know, it isn't the kind of art I want around me. And I think there are other things that, to me, tell me more, communicate more, say more.
You have roots here in Casper, but is there any other reasons involving your art that you would want to be located here?
I like Casper, and I shouldn't say that in such a defensive way, probably. I do like Casper. I have friends from, you know, the coast that come to Casper just because they think it's so weird. And, you know, I can understand that. I can see that. If you grow up in, you know, a metropolitan area, it's definitely a different kind of place. And I don't know, you know, having grown up here, I'm sure has an awful lot to do with why I feel comfortable here. There's also the thing of, in a town the size of Casper, I personally, I think, can make an impact on certain things. I do a lot of work with the Nicolason Art Museum. I am able to go around to schools and to talk to kids and to work with kids, things like that. In other words, I feel that I'm really a part of this community, partly because of its size, partly because of, you know, I know people in the community because I grew up here, and I feel that I'm a part of the community, can have some input into the community, and this community nourishes me in those ways too. I have a following of people here who like my work and are into my work, so you know, it's kind of a comfortable place to live all around. It's not the kind of market, you know, to talk about art as a commodity in the marketplace.
Did you get much encouragement from your teachers, your art teachers in the schools of Wyoming?
I didn't feel that opportunities were closed off, but I didn't feel a lot of encouragement necessarily. I think back in those days, what I remember of art classes were just, you know, you sit around and cut linoleum blocks, or you know, draw, and there was not a lot of direction given to it, not a lot of emphasis on what ideas could be behind art, things like that. But, you know, I had fun doing it, and I always liked it.
Where did you get your art education?
After I graduated from high school here, I went to Occidental College, which is a small liberal arts college in Los Angeles, and spent 4 years and got an undergraduate degree from there. It was an interesting time. It was 1966 to 1970, which was the place to be. It was in LA in the 60s. And so I gained, I think, more just from being there than I did academically. What was happening at a lot of colleges at that time was that the authorities, the establishment of academe, was backing off of a lot of the 3 R's type of stuff in favor of independent study, in favor of all of those things that happened during the 60s that changed academic life. And consequently, there was a lot of experimentation in various ways going on, but not a lot of the nuts and bolts, like I was saying, color theory and figure drawing, things like that. Might have been there, but nobody was paying attention. We were all too busy anti-war marches and you know, social activity.
Has the political content of some of your work caused you any problems?
It hasn't really. I usually, you know, tell teachers beforehand that, you know, some of the pieces I'm going to be bringing to show the kids have kind of political or social points to them, and that can engender, you know, really good discussion. Part of the important thing to me is that business I was talking about a little earlier, is that art is really a form of communication, and if we get into a debate, you know, on that, well, why did you know, choose this idea, and, you know, isn't art supposed to be pretty and something that's not going to cause controversy? I mean, that's a good opening for a lot of thoughts about what art is and does and can do. This piece is called Reagan Bush Memorial. It's typical in construction, typical of the clocks I make, and I picked up the techniques used in building these clocks when I was building architectural models for several years. This particular piece, the Reagan Bush Memorial, started out as just an idea that, gosh, you know, these people plundered America for a number of years, and they deserve to be memorialized for it. Aesthetically, the idea came about as a contrast between an official kind of monument and a reaction to that monument, which in this case is the graffiti on it. This is obviously a pretty pointed piece politically. I usually take this piece when I go to talk to school groups because it can sometimes engender some pretty good discussion about the role of art, about you know, what art can and can't say. Some of the graffiti on this clock is pretty down and dirty in terms of political point, and it engenders good discussion. The idea of Wyoming art, if people think of Wyoming art, it's sometimes very specific to that kind of realistic aesthetic. We had, every once in a while at the Nicolason Museum, there are complaints that why don't we show Wyoming artists? And, you know, I would say that 70% of the artists shown are from Wyoming. But what the people who ask that mean is, why don't we show what they perceive as being Wyoming art, which again is that realistic, you know, Western or kind of mountain scene aesthetic. Someone just recently told me that one of the software companies is working on a program so that you can marble on computer, which theoretically, you know, the math of it is right there. Chaos theory explains some things that happen in marbling, and that's something that fractals is something that happens in marbling that happens on the computer screen. So it'd be interesting to see. I was joking earlier that we could, you know, when they come out with these programs, we could throw away our marbling tanks and just do it all in computer.
In the not-too-distant future, computers will be able to make these patterns, and no one will have to get paint on his clothes. Will we be able to tell? I hope so. At Tom West's marbling tank, the hands of the artist are still essential.
Main Street, Wyoming is made possible in part by grants from Kennecott Energy, proud to be a part of Wyoming's future in the uranium exploration, mining, and production industry, and by the Wyoming Council for the Humanities, enriching lives of Wyoming people through the study of Wyoming history, values, and ideas.